Astonishing Legends Network.
Listen to the Astonishing Junk Drawer exclusively at patreon.com/astonishinglegends. A giant up on a mountain range.
I just got stopped by like some CIA agent.
You know there's something right behind you.
What?
Ed, you seem like you have something you want to say.
I don't think you can park there.
So you've been to Point Pleasant.
It's near a Cheesecake Factory. This is all looking up. Men in Black, law enforcement thing.
If he was shooting that on the way up, he would have had to go way out of his way.
CIA or...
I just want to give you an update. I'm not dead.
Well, that's why this is on Patreon.
Legends are still being created right now.
Astonishing Legends would like to thank Cremo Body Wash, Mint Mobile, Squarespace, our contributors at patreon.com, and you, our listeners, for making tonight's show possible.
On September 19th, 1961, Barney and Betty Hill decided they wanted to take a honeymoon. They'd been married a year and a half already, but long work commutes and late shifts had gotten in the way. It seemed like a good time for a drive to Niagara Falls from their home in New Hampshire, so they piled into their 1957 Chevy Bel Air with their dachshund, Delcy, and hit the road. Betty was an educated, intelligent woman in her early 40s. Barney, 2 years younger, was an ex-Army man who worked for the United States Post Office in Boston, 60 miles from their home in Portsmouth. He was extremely active in the civil rights movement, and both of them were respected by their peers. What they couldn't know was that on that long-ago night, on a remote back road, they would encounter something that would change their lives forever. Betty and Barney Hill claimed to have been stopped on their trip by a UFO. By 1961, plenty of people had seen UFOs, or UAPs as they're now known, but this encounter was different. Something far more intense happened to the Hills, resulting in around 2 hours of missing time, nightmares, and embarrassing health issues that couldn't be explained. Betty had nightmares following the event, and eventually they both agreed to hypnosis sessions with Dr. Benjamin Simon in an effort to figure out what had happened to them. While a controversial method, the sessions revealed what may be granular details of what they endured during the lost hours of that early September morning, and they were terrifying. Many skeptics will say that information recovered through hypnosis is irrelevant, and maybe it is. But the reason this case is so extraordinary is that there's been a scientific analysis of the physical evidence as well as an analysis of Betty and Barney's conscious recollection of events, meaning statements they made while not under hypnosis at all. We have the great fortune of being in touch with Betty and Barney Hill's niece, author and experiencer advocate, Kathleen Marden, who is, as you might expect, an expert on this case and was actually personally present for many of the events pertaining to it. There are many stories of abduction out there, but the Betty and Barney Hill case is truly astonishing.
Welcome back to Astonishing Legends. I'm Scott Philbrook, and this is Forrest Burgess.
Oh my God, they're not what I expected. They don't look like I expected them to look. They look like people, but they're sort of grotesque. Betty Hill, recounting a nightmare she had in a note to Dr. Benjamin Simon, late spring 1964 from Stanton Friedman and Kathleen Marden's book, captured the Betty and Barney Hill UFO experience.
Join us tonight for part 1 of our 2-part special series on the infamous UFO encounter and abduction of Betty and Barney Hill.
And we're back.
That we are, folks, back from Monsterfest, and man, that was a blast.
Oh, indeed it was. We'd like to personally thank everyone who came up and spoke to us and supported the show, as well as all the folks who attended the live show downstairs. Boy, was that a lot of fun. And a lot of weird.
Yes, it was.
If you only knew what was going on in the background. Not too much, but it was... It was fine and fun. It was great to see everybody. And a great big thank you to all of our Facebook mods, the lounge manager, and our super fans who are there to help us out. It always warms our hearts to see everyone.
Yes, it does. And we have some extras of the special shirts we made just for Monsterfest. So if you're interested in those, or you came up to our table and we didn't have your size, visit astonishinglegends.com, Click on shop and find our apparel and gear. You'll see the Monster Fest t-shirts. We had also taken all of our knit cap beanies to Monster Fest, so the ones that we still have on hand will be back on the website soon if they haven't already been added. And if you don't see the Monster Fest t-shirts by the time this show goes up, just check back in a few days. We're counting up that inventory to put them back up there.
Well, a shout out to all the other cool vendors and podcasts we met there. There's just so many of them, and we're glad to have said hello and greetings and great to see people back again. It was much like our trip to Kent Paranormal Weekend back in the day when we met Jim Harold and Seth Breedlove from Small Town Monsters. Just what a legacy that would be of friendship and monumental.
Yes.
And enduring friendships were made, and they always are, these things, and it's great to see everybody.
Yes, and also, folks, this weekend is a big weekend for the Astonishing Legends Network because all 4 shows on the network have new episodes dropping this weekend. So there's obviously the new Astonishing Legends, which you're listening to now, but also Scared All the Time posted today as well. There's also a new Midnight Library on Sunday, the day after this show posts. It's about the most haunted pubs in the world, so that's a fun one, too.
And then on Richard Haddam's Paranormal Bookshelf, we have part 2 of 3 of the Miracles series.
Yeah, folks, so if you're looking for a lot of cool new content this weekend, find and subscribe to the Midnight Library, Scared All the Time, and Richard Haddam's Paranormal Bookshelf wherever you get your podcasts. Oh, and to that guy who wrote in complaining it's too hard to find one place for the whole network, we're working on that. Wait, we just got a bid for that website today, and we're working on doing that in other ways, too. So,
really?
Yeah, so thanks for reminding us to get that done.
This is an amazing story. It's, talk about legendary.
It really is.
This is one of the classics, and you think you may have been able to just dismiss it, but you're wrong.
Yeah, and I'll tell you what, I didn't know a lot about this story, and that's, of course, me. You know how I've always given you a hard time over the years.
I know.
No spoilers, right, is what I always say to you. But my thing is, like, sometimes when there's a big story like this one, I go out of my way not to expose myself to it. Like, I kind of want to wait so I can savor it, like that great pint of ice cream that you just brought home from the grocery store. I'll just wait. And when we dove into this, I didn't realize how complex and multidimensional this case was. This is so much more than just an anecdote from a couple of people who saw a UFO in their car. It's a lot more than that. And I was really enthralled by it. I found it invigorating. It reminded me why we do this show.
Right.
I'm real excited for us to talk about this.
Well, there's a reason it's endured so long and is so, in my opinion, not easily dismissed, because it could be a mundane thing, but so much other extraordinary stuff happened around it that I think it's hard to dismiss. You have to really dive into this. And that's what Stanton Freeman and Kathleen Martin did for decades, with a personal connection and also with a scientific eye. And because of those two people, and what a great and phenomenal job they did with that, we're going to lean most heavily on the source we trusted the most.
Yes.
This is, I think, you could say the Bible on it. And it's titled Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience, the true story of the world's first documented alien abduction. And this would be the 60th anniversary edition. And again, this was co-authored by the late, great Stanton Friedman and Betty Hill's niece, Kathleen Martin, who will be joining us for part 2.
Yes, we have the great Jim Harold to thank for that. So, Jim, thank you very much for connecting us with Kathleen. All right, there's a lot to this encounter, but we need to start at the start, and that's the actual night in question.
Indeed. And we need to keep in mind, this series of events was told by Barney and Betty to various researchers very closely after they occurred, but also under hypnosis during months of sessions with Dr. Benjamin Simon.
Yeah, and as we said in the cold open, there's a fair amount of debate over the reliability of information obtained under hypnosis. And actually, some people would say the debate's over. You can't rely on it. So what we're going to do is tell the initial version of the story here strictly from Betty and Barney's conscious memories. Those memories are subject to the normal fallacies associated with eyewitness testimony, but they are not open to the question of being obtained under hypnosis.
Good point, sir, but I want to say something else before I forget to say it 5 hours from now. In reading the book, one thing that came to mind, and they do a very good job, very exact and precise about what anecdotes and details and information and data was obtained through hypnosis, through Betty's dreams, and through their conscious reports, both right after the incident, several months or years later, and then after all the hypnosis sessions, and then years after that. So it's a melange of just recollections and data. And yeah, that can all get mushed. But what stood out to me the most, and one of the most fascinating things to me, is just the fluidity, I guess, of the human subconscious.
Yeah.
And how it kind of puts something like this, so traumatic, all together in memory, in fear, in trauma, and that's what we have there.
It's almost like a kind of Rashomon.
Yeah.
Instead of multiple
Right.
characters, it's different versions of yourself. It's the hypnotized version, the memory, the
Right.
eyewitness version, the dream version. You take all those things together and try to feel out what really happened. And, I know we reference Rashomon a lot, and we're old guys
Sure.
and we both studied film. For those of you that don't know it, it's a famous movie by Akira Kurosawa. You can find it pretty much anywhere. Watch it. It's really amazing, gorgeous black and white movie. Famous, whatever. But the point of it is that's about a crime that gets committed and the different viewpoints of all the people who were part of it. And that's the comparison we're making here. So
Yes, and I would say you could easily dismiss this because, as we know, there's some obvious things about hypnotic regression, but I think what you can't dismiss is that something very traumatic and otherworldly, perhaps, happened to this couple, other than just misidentifying a light on a hill as they were
Yeah.
driving and
Yeah.
being tired.
right.
And so, from the point of view of hypnosis and eyewitness testimony, as a result, the initial information is going to have some holes in it because there are things they simply couldn't remember about what happened to them. And so, what we're going to do here is framing the nuts and bolts of the story exactly as a pair of eyewitnesses remember it. Even though there are more details that come from the hypnosis sessions, the information they shared as conscious waking memories shortly after it happened can be considered the most reliable. Even with the holes in the events or things they can't remember, there's still some verifiable physical evidence as well as other circumstantial evidence that multiple additional eyewitnesses corroborated.
Exactly. So for the folks who often aren't paying attention or lean toward the skeptical side, I want to restate this. All of the information we're about to impart was based on memories that Betty and Barney had and relayed to folks after the event while they were wide awake and not under hypnosis. After we do this, we'll talk about the information that was obtained by hypnosis, but that's for later.
That's what you got. You got
Yes.
an anecdote.
Exactly.
Well, along with physical evidence as well.
Yes.
So you have that, but you have their stories. And so there are levels, I guess, of credibility and believability or baby out with the bathwaters kind of things. Well, these details are paraphrased from Stanton Friedman and Kathleen Martin's book, Captured, which we mentioned earlier. So by September of 1961, Barney Hill was working in South Boston for the U.S. Postal Service, and he had been transferred there from Philadelphia, where he was working when he had first met Betty about a year and a half earlier. And that was over 6 hours by car from her home in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. So Boston being an hour each way, this was a welcome change. And they had not honeymooned since being married 18 months earlier, so Barney asked for some time off, which they gave him so he could surprise Betty by taking her to Niagara Falls and Montreal. And on Sunday, the 17th, they packed up the car, including their dachshund, named Delcy, and a pistol for protection in case they had to sleep on the road somewhere. Their trip took them to Niagara Falls, Toronto, to Thousand Islands area, and then Montreal. And they were going to stay in Montreal, but Barney got lost due to having some problems understanding directions he'd gotten in French. Also very understandable.
Yeah, and the other interesting thing that's happening at this moment is the very first hurricane to be discovered by satellite was bearing down on New Hampshire. Esther had been a Category 5 hurricane initially, but by the time it got up towards New England, it had diminished to a tropical storm. It was still a threat to their home in New Hampshire. Barney was driving as they traveled along the newly finished Interstate 93 in New Hampshire. The skies were actually clear, which is usually how they are when a hurricane is on a distant approach. It was September 19th now, and they were on their way home when Betty noticed something in the sky southwest of their position. She thought it was a shooting star.
But then it stopped, dead still. And after that, it began moving upward in the sky toward the moon. And as you mentioned here with the satellites, that's what Betty thought it was at first. It must be a satellite, and her first sighting of one. So she told Barney to pull over so he could have a look at it too. They both used binoculars to observe it, and at one point, it even passed in front of the moon. Then, it looked to be descending toward them rather quickly.
It's at this point I want to remind folks again, these details were remembered plainly by both Betty and Barney prior to any kind of hypnosis taking place.
Gotcha. Well, looking through the binoculars, it changed directions multiple times. And Barney had told Betty it was just an airliner on its way to Canada, but he too saw it changing course several times through the binoculars. So then they returned to the road driving south on Route 3, parallel to I-93. Barney was a practical man. He didn't believe in what at the time the world called flying saucers. So he kept driving, thinking maybe they should just stop somewhere to spend the night. and then this thing and the idea of it would go away. But he kept driving, and every now and then they would pull over to see what this thing was doing.
It became clear this thing, whatever it was aware of them, and on top of that, toying with them. They came around a curve on Route 3, revealing a landmark known as Indian Head. Now, I want to read from a Wikipedia page about what this is. Mount Pimajawasset, or Indian Head, is a mountain in Franconia Notch in the White Mountains in Grafton County, New Hampshire, U.S. It lies near the town of Lincoln. The mountain is known for the distinctive cliff along the southern side of its summit, which resembles the profile of a Native American head. The face, and this is important later as being relevant to what they were seeing in the sky, the face of the Native American man measures 98 feet from chin to forehead, and the mountain itself has an elevation of about 2,530 feet.
And along with Indian Head, 8 to 10 stories in the air, was a large flat disc, just floating, not making a sound. Barney pulled over and grabbed the binoculars again, climbing out of the car. And as soon as he looked at it, it moved over a field next to the road. So Barney grabbed Betty's pistol and put it in his pocket, and then he walked down towards the disc. Now, he estimated it was about 60 to 80 feet in diameter.
I'd like to read this quote from page 32 of Friedman and Martin's book. Quote, lifting his binoculars to his eyes, he spied a group of humanoid figures moving about with the precision of military officers. As the craft tilted downward and began to descend toward him, one of the strange creatures that remained at the window communicated a frightening message. Barney had the immediate impression that he was in danger of being plucked from the field. Overcome with fear and with all of the courage that he could muster, he tore the binoculars from his face and raced back to the car. Breathless, trembling, and in near hysterics, he told Betty that they needed to get out of there or they were going to be captured, end quote.
So they got back in the 57 Chevy and tore out of there, driving in silence. And then, as they were driving, they heard a strange buzzing sound and felt vibrations pouring through the car. It stopped and then started again. They both had vague memories of coming across a roadblock and a huge fiery red orb sitting on the ground. And they wanted to find other humans. So Barney steered them onto Route 4 to take them to Portsmouth, where they thought they'd arrive around 3 a.m. But by the time they got there, it was dawn. 2 hours of their lives had vanished.
So here we are again, last reminder, and I'm only doing this because so many people think they know what this case is, and they throw the paranormal baby out with the bathwater, as Forrest said a few minutes ago, when they hear the word hypnosis. But none of what you just heard was recalled under hypnosis.
Now, with that being said, let's get back to the real world, or the world that seemed real to Betty and Barney that night, what they knew of as their normal, regular lives, until they saw a light in the sky. And this story, it happens so many times where it starts off like that. Like, everything was going great until I saw this.
One of the things that is freaky about this story and some of the other abduction cases that I think about specifically people that we've talked to on our show, like Terry Lovelace with the incident at Devil's Den, and other famous cases where even though these things are really far away, they seem to notice that you're engaging with them. And how do they do that from that distance? It seems like it's more than just, let's say they have the technology of infrared readings or heat sensors like the U.S. military has right now, or a lot of militaries, I should say. And they're looking down and they see animals in a field in the night because they're giving off a heat signature or whatever. But it's more than that. It's like one of our favorite quotes from Richard Haddam's movie, The Mothman Prophecies, right? You do it because you can do the impression better than me.
No, I can't, but here we go.
Come on, go ahead. Just give it a shot.
You noticed them, and they noticed you noticing them.
That's one of those things that goes into the column of there seems to be more than just visual or a technological recognition of whatever their target is. It seems almost like a subconscious connection.
Yeah.
Identifying the thing that they're, or the person in this case, that they're going to interact with, even if they're a great distance away.
Well, sir, you're now jumping to part 2 territory here, in that this is ECETI stuff. ECETI. You should look that up.
Yeah.
Just go to eceti.org and enter the Lion's Gate. Well, that's what it says on the splash page.
Oh,
very fascinating organization and practice with these folks because it gets very metaphysical, very spiritual. And that's what I'm talking about, is the connection. All right, let me just read their website before I get into trouble here. The aim of ECETI, which stands for Enlightened Contact with Extraterrestrial Intelligence, is to help with public awareness of the ET reality and to assist people with connecting to positive, otherworldly beings. Also, eSETI shares wisdom and teachings in all areas and is a place where addressing issues such as poverty, the environment, new technologies, food, health, happiness, and well-being, along with self-mastery, is being done. So it is kind of a self-enlightenment, a raising of consciousness and awareness through spiritual and psychic connections with ETs. And so it's much more beyond that, rather than just seeing them and let's capture one and do an autopsy and see what they're made of. It's connecting with extraterrestrial
Wait, which side are you talking
intelligence.
about there? Who's doing the capturing and the autopsies? It seems like that runs both ways. Possibly.
Yes, you're right. And that's another important aspect. And as I have done more research into some of these other connected stories, which Scott is afraid to cover, it's just going too deep into that shadow government area.
Yeah, but by the way, that's not fear. I'm not afraid. I'm choosing to make a different choice.
Oh,
with
I
my
see.
path
Yeah,
in
no.
life.
Listen,
Yeah.
I don't want I don't want taps or bugs or anything happening to us. Just because I got enough to worry about here. But that's one area of, I guess, unraveling this technology or this higher intelligence is the nuts and bolts approach, where you capture one, you get a dead one, you slice it open, you see what's working on the insides, and then the other is to address it with consciousness and with spirituality and with metaphysics, that kind of approach. And so that's what's happening again on the other side. But I think maybe it was John Keel, like you could take a flashlight and wave it up and down, and you might see the light off in the distance match your movements.
And there's a lot of that very mundane, basic sort of signaling, like when you wave at an airplane and it tips its wings to you. There's something going on there with like, oh, it's talking to us and we're talking back to it. Hi, hey, down there. How are you?
Yeah.
Man, Monster Fest was really a blast this year. Talk about meeting a lot of people.
Oh, I hear you, brother. We were pressing the flesh for 16 hours straight, and it was HOT hot in Ohio, even inside. So, of course, I took a shower before the flight, like in the middle of the night, and then before we hit the convention floor, I was still smelling fresh, even after that long day of travel the night before, and I felt and smelled great the whole time. You know, I told you to check it out a while back, but their new bourbon vanilla scent is excellent and absolutely worth trying.
Totally. I actually got some too on your recommendation, and I brought the same one to Monster Fest. The new bourbon vanilla scent actually evolves as you wash, and it smells incredible. On top of that, it held up to hundreds of selfies and merch t-shirt, size search panic sweats when people were like, oh, I need a small, and we had like 15 piles of not very well organized stuff.
Right.
But the last thing we wanted was for our favorite listeners and fans to be like, yeah, I met Scott and Forrest. They were nice, but man, they stunk.
Well, that's a little steep assessment there, but you know, it wasn't a problem because we came prepared, and you don't have to be running a merch table at a convention to want to elevate and even enhance your hygiene routine. And Cremo Body Wash is the best way to do that.
Cremo combines rich lathering, hydrating formulas with meticulously balanced, multi-layered fragrances for a superior shower experience.
Yeah, and it's not just a superior shower experience. Their newest men's body wash scent transcends that. It makes a shower feel like a luxury experience. The bourbon vanilla scent invigorates the senses with bold distiller's spices perfectly balanced with notes of rich Madagascar vanilla and aged oak to give you a shower that meets even the highest of standards.
You sound like you're talking about a fine wine, man.
Yeah.
But I get it. It really is more than your average body wash. I love the folks at the Doubletree in Canton, Ohio, where Monster Fest was held, but thanks to traveling with some Cremo Bourbon Vanilla Body Wash, I felt like I was staying in a 5-star resort in Hawaii or something. In fact, the first thing I did when the convention floor closed after getting our unsold merch packed up for shipping was go back to my room for my second shower of the day, because Cremo's Body Wash not only gets me clean in the morning, it relaxes me after a long day thanks to how therapeutic that bourbon and vanilla scent smells. It's like aromatherapy.
Absolutely. I told you that last time. It really soothes you. And you think we can convince Seth to hold the next Monster Fest in Hawaii?
I'm not optimistic, but one can always dream. It'd be fun to go and look for the night marchers.
Well, they certainly have their own delightful monsters. Well, we may not make it to Hawaii for the next Monster Fest, but wherever we are, we know we're going to smell amazing. Cremo works with master perfumers to ensure that every Cremo body wash scent is meticulously blended and refined, and their hard work definitely shows. It smells like a high-end cologne.
Cremo also has a lot of other grooming products for men, including shave cream, beard oil, and shampoo, all in a variety of distinct masculine scents.
You can find Cremo Men's Body Wash in its new distinctive bourbon vanilla scent at Walmart or Walmart.com.
Once again, that's at Walmart or Walmart.com. I tell you, man, I love a good deal as much as the next guy, but I'm not going to crawl through a bed of hot coals just to save a few bucks. I'm kind of lazy that way.
Old age will do that to you, my man. Because I ain't got time for jumping through a bunch of hoops either. Plus, whenever there's a lot of BS like that, it's generally hiding some gadget you don't see. Like, do all this crap, it's an amazing deal. And then they don't tell you that they're going to balance it all out for you by sending you a debit card 4 months later that you'll lose, or being able to spend down to zero and they keep the change.
Exactly. I can't stand that kind of stuff. So annoying. A good deal has to be easy. No fiery hoops to jump through. So when Mint Mobile said it was easy to get wireless for $15 a month with the purchase of a 3-month plan, well, we knew it was true because we've been with Mint Mobile ever since they first sponsored us at least 6 years ago now, and we both saved literally thousands of dollars.
That is absolutely right. And it turns out it really is that easy to get wireless for just $15 a month. The longest part of the process for you will be the time you spend on hold breaking up with your old provider. Switching to Mint Mobile, though, is a breeze. The website is a piece of cake to navigate, and it's easy to purchase new service and even keep your existing phone and phone number if you want.
They have an excellent app, too, on the smartphone for managing your account, although I rarely have to use it because the service just works.
To get started, go to mintmobile.com/AL. There, you'll see that all 3-month plans, including the unlimited plan, are only $15 a month.
All plans come with high-speed data and unlimited talk and text delivered on the nation's largest 5G network. You can use your own phone with any Mint Mobile plan and bring your phone number along with all your existing contacts.
Find out how easy it is to switch to Mint Mobile and get 3 months of premium wireless service for $15 a month.
To get this new customer offer and your new 3-month unlimited wireless plan for just $15 a month, go to mintmobile.com/AL.
That's mintmobile.com/AL.
Cut your wireless bill to $15 a month at mintmobile.com/AL.
$45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 a month.
New customers on first 3-month plan only.
Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited plan.
Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply.
See Mint Mobile for details.
Hi, I'm Will.
And I'm Lauren. And you're listening to Astonishing Legends with Scott Philbrook and Forrest Burgess. Now let's get back to the show.
Here's the thing I wanted to come back to about the story that really jumped out at me, and it's something that I want people to understand because we're relaying the parts here in part one that they remember consciously, that they did without hypnosis and not necessarily from dreams. And that is the fact that when they were driving along, I actually want to read this section that you just read a few minutes ago. So they got back in the 57 Chevy and they tore out of there, driving in silence. Then, as they were driving, they heard a strange buzzing sound and felt vibrations pouring through the car. And that stopped, and then it started again. And at that point, they both had vague memories of coming across a roadblock and a huge fiery red orb sitting on the ground. The thing about those sounds that we just heard in the story that played a few minutes ago is that when they started and stopped, after the second ones, they had the vague memory of the roadblock and the fiery orange orb, is that something happened between those sounds, that they bookended a section of missing time for Barney and Betty.
I took that to mean they were hearing some kind of technology that immobilized them and allowed access to capture them and, stop the car, all that kind of fun stuff. And it has a sound. It's a machine that does that.
Yeah. It's some kind of ray.
Yeah. Well,
like not a death ray. In this case, it's a freeze ray or a time freeze ray or something. But whatever it was, it signaled that, okay, we got you now. Yeah. And then it also signals, okay, we're done with you. And you don't remember anything between those two things.
Rich Haddam's favorite line, or one of them is, what can we do to make you stop screaming?
Yeah.
Because it's, again, we've talked about this before. They don't seem to care too much, or they don't understand and then don't care about physical pain that humans experience, because they think like, well, what do you care? You're not going to remember this anyway. So, pain is no memory. And so they don't care. And I can't remember if that was, that also came from Terry Lovelace or not, but another experiencer who said that's the impression they got. Is like, well, what's the big deal? I know it hurts now, but you won't remember this. We'll make sure. And then they're not totally perfect because you do remember a lot of it. And I'm going to break our rule here right now about teasing something that will be covered more in part 2. But there is also, which seems like magic, because Betty was in pain. You can talk to how she remembered this. She was in pain from one of the experiments they were doing on her, and they realized she was, that like, oh, well, I guess they keep talking about this thing called anesthesia. Well, we don't have any of that, so I'm just making that part up. But he put his hand over her face, or waved his hand over her face, and the pain immediately stopped.
But again, with our part 1 here, That was recalled under hypnosis.
I know. That's why I wanted you to clarify that.
Just so everyone understands. Yeah, I'm trying to keep those things out of part one.
I understand.
So,
I wanted to say, though, that is not uncommon with experiencers, whether recovered under hypnosis or just parts that they remembered later. Somehow there's a magical touch to some of these aliens, and maybe the higher up ones, the mantis, people in charge, the higher evolved leaders or controllers or commanders that are on these ships or with these experiences, that they have some kind of, a psychic ability. That, Terry Lovelace said the mantis being turned his way saw that he was able to move his eyes, which he shouldn't have. He wasn't totally paralyzed, and that he couldn't move his body, but he could look around, and the mantis man, you're awake a little. And he immediately read every thought that he had in his head, like knew all of his memories, all of his thoughts, maybe even the future, who knows. And it was a very soul-sucking and frightening experience just knowing that a being could do that.
Oh, that was the HMIC, the head mantis in charge.
Head mantis in charge, exactly. So, but here you have something that is not consciously recalled, but there does seem to be a connection, you're right, that I've heard many times that is more psychic and not just communicating with, one aspect of it would be communicating without words. That's very common. It happened to Indrid Cold, speaking of Mothman. And that he seemed to be reading Woody Derenberger's thoughts, but also could talk. So we have a little bit of that combined here. But yes, you're right. There's some kind of connection that is apart from the technology they use, because I often wonder too, it's like, even if you're just on the road, can they just sense you like the Star Trek Enterprise can, like they know how many life forms are where
in the car, whatever. It also begs the question, are you being tracked? Is there a tracking device in you of some kind that allows them to continue to track you? And does that mean that you've been grabbed over and over again? Does it mean that you've been grabbed at least once before? And then if you haven't been grabbed at least once before, then how do they find you again? And some of that comes up in Betty and Barney's story. There's a point in which they say, we found you once and we'll find you again. Don't worry,
we'll be back. I'll see you in time. But let's get back to what they both consciously remember seeing and experiencing, because it's as concrete as we can get.
It is. And, and that's a good point. Again, these are conscious, pretty clear memories. Really, the part that they remember is clear. There's missing time, but outside of the missing time, they remember a lot. Yeah. And on top of that, they both observed this thing, whatever it was, through binoculars. And that's something you don't get a lot. I mean, people just like to pull over. Oh, it was far away. It was a dot of light. It bounced around. It went behind the trees. They actually had binoculars with them, and they both took turns looking at this and pulling over multiple times through the binoculars. And that makes it even harder to imagine that, they're fabricating it. They were mistaken. How could they know? They are laying eyes on this thing, stone cold sober, driving home in the night and pulling off the road and looking at it up close through the binoculars. And the other thing that I think is really interesting is when Barney talks about being out in the field and looking through the binoculars and having this one being like look back at him, and it's like, I'm about to be caught. I need to get out of here. Like he went to full-blown fight or flight and like ran out of the field and, back to the car.
Yeah, what I imagine in reading the story here is the progression of excitable feelings, in that imagine if it was you and you're driving along with your significant other just out of vacation, you're still having a good time. It's a lovely, relaxing nighttime drive back home. And you see something unusual, and at first you think like, well, that's an unusual light. It's moving erratically. That's one thing I'll say here too, that kind of tracks with other later descriptions.
Non-ballistic motion.
Yeah, that she noticed that the craft moved erratically and bounced back and forth. And I would suggest that, unless it's Plan 9 from outer space and things are dangling from monofilament line, is that generally everything we see in the movies, the craft don't act that way in sci-fi. They're rockets, they're cheesy looking rockets and saucers, but they all have kind of ballistic motion because that's what we're used to. And so this description tracks more with people who have seen many more UAP sightings up to recent times, in that the falling leaf motion that happens.
And that comes up all the time, folks, by the way, that the UFO or the craft that people are seeing, UAP, exhibits a kind of falling leaf pattern as it comes down in the sky.
Right, bounced back and forth. Yeah. Just briefly here, something that Dorothy Izat said, we might cover her one day. It's a fascinating story. A lovely woman who took a lot, like tons of Super 8 footage and photos of craft that were communicating with her in the manner that you specified earlier. And that at one point she claims, and has a photo, that they wrote her name out in lights. You see people that you see them on Instagram now. Yeah. with long bulb exposures, or what I'm saying, like open shutter exposures in the dark, and they take paintings. Some kind of craft did that and spelled out her name in cursive in the sky. The other thing is that the light that was on the film overlaps the frame lines, which is impossible unless there's a direct light leak into the camera somehow. And so like that's not supposed to happen. But anyway, that seems to be her case, some kind of psychic connection with her and them returning. But back to how did they experience this? What was going through their minds? And it's like, that's a really unusual light. It's changing color. It's moving erratically. And as normal, rational, upstanding people would do, as Barney did, it's like, well, that's got to be a jetliner. That's got to be an aircraft on its way back to Montreal, I think is what he said. He said, until the fight or flight response comes in, when he starts to realize like it's not going left or right or going away, it's coming towards us. It knows we're here. And that moment, that feeling kicks in, which must be at first tremendously exhilarating and exciting, turning to abject fear.
Because there's the point at which you realize you are no longer the top, most intelligent and technically advantaged predator in the scenario, or even survivor. You're dealing with something that has an ability to outplay you at chess, and you don't know what to do next or what you need to do to survive. Well, let's talk a little bit about after these guys got home from this event. And this is something that I thought was really interesting. When they got back to their house, and keeping in mind that their memories of what may have happened, for them, it was a continuous event. They drove, they saw it in the sky, then they looked at it through binoculars and it was coming towards them. They got in the car and they drove home. Along the way, they heard these sounds, but they don't know what happened in the middle there and they don't even know if anything happened, but they do know that they got home about 2 hours later than they should have. But when they come in the house, they both apparently felt really calm and peaceful and relaxed, which I think is really interesting. That's something that they both described. It's like, no, we felt very, very calm. And so again, they
got their lollipop from visiting the doctor. I'm being facetious, but I think there was something that was administered to them. So they wouldn't be crying, freaking out messes by the side of the road. They could at least get on going, because it seems also what these beings want is like, they tag them and bag them. But to kind of cover their tracks, they put you back on your way. It's just not 100%. That's what I would say. Like, memories come through.
And that's the thing. At that point, they didn't realize that time was missing. But like you said, whatever it was something that lasted long enough for them to drive home that they still felt calm, which to me comes back to the thing we bring up in multiple shows, and that's the paranormal apathy.
Yes.
Just this idea. It's like, oh, I've experienced something. I woke up in bed and there was a monster staring at me, 1 foot away. So I rolled over and went back to sleep. And it's like, okay.
It's funny you just said that. Just recently, a very good friend of mine said that they saw a strange light coming through their tent while out camping. And at first was like, well, that's weird. And then eventually went to sleep without checking it out. Yeah, that sounds like paranormal apathy, where I don't know if you're meant to do that, or if it's part of the phenomenon, or it's like a special ray or a special, like an extra little frequency they tag onto the phenomenon that they're beaming towards you, or that's just around, where you don't seem to care. We've run into that so many times.
Well, and this is the thing that I wonder. It's like, I think about those folks that put animals into trances, like the divers that somehow convince a shark to like balance on its nose while they stroke its belly or whatever, and it's just frozen or whatever. And I think you can do that. Can you do that with alligators too?
Yes. There's one way. I think if you go from head to tail, it relaxes them and kind of puts them into a trance.
I think there's we must have some kind of trigger that these things know about where they can put us in that mode. They're manipulating us. And we're like, okay, wait, if we're going to grab this thing and poke it and prod it and test it and pull hair out of its head, we got to do this first.
There's ways to hypnotize of sorts animals lower on the food chain than us. Like I was going to say, you run your finger around a chicken's head, like, make an imaginary 360-degree circle. And then when you're back to the front where they're looking, you place your finger down to the ground, and they'll look at that spot and keep looking at it for a long time.
I've heard that, but have you practiced that, or is that an old wives' tale?
No, but look it up. Apparently, I've heard some farmer folks say that is true, but who knows?
Well, it also sounds like something your great-granddad tells you and then watches you go out and try and do it and laughs the whole time while nothing's happening.
Well, you can hypnotize some folks, and stage hypnotism, if you watch the show, this is pretty common, is that there'll be a few people that don't fall asleep. And as everyone else does, you'll see the hypnotist like kind of get them off, like, okay, all right, let's get off the stage. And they'll just go off the stage.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, I do know some folks who just pretended to be under hypnosis to play along. Because he's like, well, it's too embarrassing now to get off the stage, so I'll just play along. The idea with the Travis Walton incident, what he claimed is that he was not put under and he got violent and he started swinging and smashing things and they just left the room. It's not like let's put a little trance on you. Like, no, we're going to come back to this. We'll revisit this. We'll put a pin in this and you calm down there, monkey man, and we'll be back in a minute. And so they could not control him at first. And so again, they're not totally omnipotent, but they do have what I believe is technology that can do that. And somehow they're able to apply mental powers to you, on you, to get you to at least hear their thoughts or communicate with you. And that might extend to being able to put you to sleep in some kind of hypnosis kind of thing. The same way, like I said, that it seems like magic, but if it does work, and again, no knock to stage hypnotists, but if you can do it that quickly, they do it very rapidly on stage. And I think that some people are more susceptible to it than others. I have heard there's some figure like 10% of the population just cannot be hypnotized. The mind is a very powerful thing, but it can also be manipulated. Yeah. So I do believe that they have that. Now, what happens to Betty and Barney, I take that with the buzzing that they felt in the car, like you said, bookended. So that put them out. They used it to bring them back. It's like when you go for an operation, they have something that puts you under. They have something that takes you back out.
That's actually a super valid point you're making there for us, because we ourselves have that technology. If you go for a procedure, like a colonoscopy or something, they give you this medicine, you close your eyes or your wisdom teeth out, and then when you open them up, it's over, and you don't remember anything most of the time, although sometimes people wake up, and you can go visit our friends at Scared All the Time for those horror stories. But you would think that an advanced alien technology, they would have that really dialed in, and maybe they do. Maybe they have it real dialed in, and this is happening to hundreds of thousands of people, and we're only hearing about the very rare cases where some kind of memory has crept back into it. I don't know.
We all react differently to medications. Not everybody will have all these side effects that are run through the pharma ads at the bottom. You may experience all these horrible things, but also will cure that itchy rash you have. So not everybody responds the same way. You may not be hearing all the times where it did work perfectly well and nobody remembered a thing. It's like, well, we went out camping and
maybe we're all Betty and Barney and we just don't know it.
It could be that Dark City scenario with Rufus Sewell where they don't ever remember it being daytime, but they know what daytime is. It's just they find themselves in a strange situation where it's like, does anybody know what's going on here? We seem to be manipulated and we can't remember the last time it was daylight, but we know what daylight is. We have memories of that.
I've never seen, I don't know that movie.
You should. It's pretty good.
Okay.
Continuing on, though, they have a pretty normal night. I think it wasn't until later, though, that things felt really wrong. It's small things like Betty. She would normally take her luggage after a trip and, unpack it in the bedroom, but she felt compelled to put it next to the back door.
Yeah.
And so you wouldn't think anything of it other than I don't normally do that. But what's that feeling? Well, it's because the luggage may be contaminated for some reason, but you don't know why yet.
Well, it turns out they had fears about radiation or possibly biological contaminants.
Right.
And this is something to remember about Betty and Barney. They're both very intelligent people. They are they understood what the implications were of what they were encountering. Even if Barney was in pretty hard denial about it, Betty was like in less denial. But again, as Forrest said, not a sci-fi fan. Neither one of them was leaning into this. So I guess after they got there, they started to want to deconstruct what had happened to them. And this is the point at which Barney says, you know what, here's what we need to do. We need to go into separate rooms, not talk about it, and let's both draw what we saw independently, which is, is a great idea. That's a clinical way to think about it. So they did that. They went into separate rooms and they made drawings. And when they came out, their drawings were very, very close matches. So they're like, okay, we were both there. We both saw the same thing, which is important in this particular case. Now, there's skeptics that might say, oh, well, this was just them home alone. This is just collusion for their hoax story. They both drew pictures, or they're saying they both did. How do we know anything? And yes, that can't really be scientifically evaluated because they were home alone, but that is something that they maintained. Just like a lot of the things that they saw, it was just the two of them looking through the binoculars and all that. We don't have additional witnesses, or do we? And we'll find out about that later. But it turns out they might not have been the only ones who saw something flying near Franconia Notch that night. But, the question is always this. It's like, if they're colluding, if it's a hoax, why would you do this? You're not really going to get fame and fortune. Sometimes you make a little money. Somebody might make a little money sometimes, but you're more likely to be ridiculed. And it's probably safe to say, with regard to Barney, the stress from this situation actually kind of led to an early death for him. He passed away just 8 years later at the young age of 46 of a cerebral hemorrhage. And there's a lot in the book Captured that Stanton Friedman and Kathleen Martin wrote about the level of stress that he was under and the anxiety he had. And I don't believe they ever outright said it, but it did seem to me like there was a little bit of PTSD with regard to being re-exposed to things that were part of the memories that they had. Like when they had this vague memory of the roadblock, at one night, apparently he was out driving around and he came up on a roadblock for construction or some other reason. And he had so much anxiety about it, he had to turn around and go back home. He went back home from that, even though he didn't have a clear memory of why the idea of a roadblock was traumatic for him.
Right. And I believe that whatever happened was tremendously terrifying and traumatizing to both of them. And another thing you brought up, it's like, why do this for the attention? And something else you have to consider if you're thinking that they're attention seekers or trying to get famous off this and make some money is that at this time, 1961, interracial marriages were fairly uncommon. And Barney was black, Betty was white. And I believe it's intimated that they did receive some displeasure from other people of their status.
Yes, it's implied that happened fairly frequently, actually.
Yeah, you're going to get some of that. And it's like, why be the nail that sticks up even higher to get hammered down? Yeah. Again, people will say, well, none of that matters. They were just attention seekers. And, even if they didn't know it, they wanted some notoriety or they're covering up something else that happened. And so they concoct this story. And here, with Betty and Barney, it's like they didn't have to tell anybody anything.
Yeah.
But the other thing I was going to say about them is there was also physical clues and evidence. Both their watches stopped working and never worked again. Betty had a tear with her zipper on the back of her dress. There seemed to be a pinkish powder that was on her dress that she hung up outside. And she didn't shake it out. I thought I'd read that in one area. And just because I wondered, like, oh, didn't you collect any of it?
The other thing that's interesting is in her state of mind, she just saw the dress and thought it was messed up. She actually initially threw it away. And then she took it out of the trash and hung it up outside and the powdery stuff blew away. So whatever that was, which is interesting. Again, they had left their stuff on the back porch. Initially, when they came home, it started raining, so they wound up bringing that inside, which tracks with Hurricane Esther, or now Tropical Storm Esther, moving into the area.
And as we said previously, it was the first storm to be tracked on satellite, which may have put it in Betty's mind that that's what this thing was that they first saw, some kind of satellite. I think last night I saw the ISS, the International Space Station, go overhead, and even though it's just a light that travels in a ballistic motion straight line.
Yeah.
It's attention grabbing and there is a wow factor with it because it's much brighter. Yeah. You know it's not a plane and you know it's not a star. You have to think about it for a minute and you have to be reminded. And if you have a Sky Guide app like I do at night, you point it up and it's like, oh, it's the ISS. That's kind of cool. And after you see it, you don't have a feeling that something is still watching you or is still with them as Barney and Betty did.
Barney initially had said to Betty, he didn't want to tell anybody. He was like, we don't need to tell anyone about this ever.
And good advice, generally, but we wouldn't be doing a show. But I think in this case, something this extraordinary, you have to tell people because I think people around you that know you well know that something's wrong, something's off. Yeah. Because they just didn't go on living happily ever after. Like they were affected by this and it showed. And so
that's right.
You're telling the people that you trust, and even then you're not sure how they're going to take it. And a lot of people just don't take it well. As we've seen with every strange paranormal story that people tell friends and relatives, some roll their eyes, some laugh at you, some stop being your friends, and some people that are very close to you actually believe that you experienced what you said you did. And so here it's always a mixed bag, but Barney said, it just doesn't do you any good. Let's not tell anybody. And I think in some parts of it, he was also a little more denial than Betty, especially when it came to her really vivid dreams. He was just kind of saying, oh, they're kind of silly. Don't pay any attention to that and let's move on.
Right. But those didn't start for 10 days, by the way, until after this.
There were delayed reactions to this. And you think you can just put it all behind you, but it will not leave you alone. So At that point, you have to tell somebody.
Right, exactly. Well, Betty clearly wanted to talk to someone about it, and so she decided that she was going to call her sister Janet Miller. Janet is actually Kathleen Marden's mom. And at the time, I think Kathleen, I'm not sure, I think she was 14 maybe at this time. So, and we'll be talking to her again in part 2. And Kathleen, or Kathy as she was called when she was younger, I guess, she overheard the conversation, the very first conversation that Betty or Barney had with an outside person about this event. Kathy, or Kathleen, was on the other end listening to her mom talk to her sister about what had happened. And one of the things that she was saying was, when we first came home, we did feel calm, but we're not feeling that anymore. We're starting to get a little bit upset, uptight, nervous. And she starts relaying that story. And that is what's really cool about this. This is now we have an outside witness, and that witness happens to be not only Kathleen's mom, but also Kathleen herself. And so that's when another person is coming into the fold here. Prior to that moment, it was just Betty and Barney. But now it's Betty and Barney and Janet and Kathy.
This podcast is brought to you by Squarespace.
You remember when we did our series on whether or not AI was sentient yet?
Yeah, almost exactly 2 years ago now. Man, time flies.
It does. And speaking of that, not so sure that one's going to age that well, because if there's anything we've all learned since then, AI is not always the sharpest knife in the drawer.
Well, no, sir. But conversely, when it's done right, it's a pretty amazing thing.
Well, one place where it's definitely done right is Squarespace's Blueprint AI and SEO tools. You can now start a completely personalized website with the new guided design system, Squarespace Blueprint. Choose from professionally curated layout and styling options to build a unique online presence from the ground up, tailored to your brand or business and optimized for every device.
That's right. And once you've got it dialed in, you can easily launch your website and get it discovered fast with integrated, optimized SEO tools. So you show up more often to more people and grow the way you want.
It truly is an amazing system and a shining example of an excellent implementation of AI in a way that's actually useful, instead of generating derivative pictures of people in impossible scenarios with 15 janky-looking fingers on each hand.
I've seen that. Yeah, and another thing you find out quick in business is that when you go to sell something, collecting payment can be way more complicated than you thought it was. A good payment system is critical to a smooth-running business, and Squarespace excels at that too. You can make checkouts seamless for your customers with simple but powerful payment tools. Accept credit cards, PayPal, and Apple Pay, and in eligible countries, offer customers the option to buy now and pay later with Afterpay and ClearPay. The last thing you want, whether you're selling merch or services or anything really, is abandoned carts because people can't figure out how to check out. Squarespace has that down to a science.
They've been around for a minute, and it shows how evolved their platform has become and continues to get. One of my other favorite new features is the Fluid Engine. It makes designing your new website or making changes to your existing Squarespace website a walk in the park. The next generation website editor couldn't make it easier for anyone to unlock unbreakable creativity. Choose your website starting point, for example, and customize every design detail with reimagined drag and drop technology for desktop or mobile. Stretch your imagination online with Fluid Engine, included in any new Squarespace site.
Launch your new website today and take advantage of not only the features we've mentioned, but tons more. All you need to do to start is go to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/legends or use code LEGENDS to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain.
That's squarespace.com/legends and code LEGENDS.
Hi, this is Amy Poehler, along with Emily Spivey and Liz Kukowski.
Hello.
Now, Emily Spivey is Scott Philbrook's wife, and she, along with Liz, make up a new podcast called Women Talking About Murder. It is a parody podcast from Paper Kite Podcasts. We have made such podcasts as Say More with Dr. Sheila and the Chris Chapman Do-Over. And much like Astonishing Legends, Women Talking About Murder talk about important, interesting, fake cases that keep you up at night. And you might even hear your favorite voice, Scott Philbrook, making an appearance. So keep listening and downloading Astonishing Legends and check out Women Talking About Murder on Odyssey or wherever you get your podcasts.
Wow, it's like you're really good at that. That was awesome.
Wow, you're good at that.
Women Talking About Murder is about two women helping women not to get murdered. This is Jo Beth. I like to stay close to home due to the fact, I've been stalked. I've almost been murdered many, many times.
This is Donna. I love it all. I'm a yes person.
I love a road trip. And I love a city at night. So I just walk around and, say hi to whoever I pass. I'll go to a temple. I'll go to a church. I'll go to a seance. I'll go to someone's basement when he says, come on over.
I'm worried sick about Donna, but that's what makes it work between us. I am sort of her protector. I like to feel that I am a mama bear to all women who are about to be murdered. Her body was found at the bottom of the Red Rocks on day 3 of a women's yoga retreat. If I could have only one bumper sticker, that bumper sticker would say, "It's always the husband."
So, JoBeth, today's murder happened on a cruise ship?
Of course it did.
I love cruises.
Of course you do. His body was found in Doug's basement, bludgeoned to death by a pet rock.
Oh, do we know the pet rock's name? Because that might be a clue.
Should we do my wrap up?
Yes.
This has been JoBeth.
And Donna.
And as always, don't go in basements. Don't cross state lines alone. Don't ever load something into the back seat of your car unless you're facing outward. Don't let the gas guy in your house ever. Don't go jogging. Don't go walking. Don't have affairs. Don't go on a cruise. Don't do sports. And finally, do not have fun. Love you all. Stay indoors, my babies.
Available on the Odyssey app or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, I'm Lauren.
And I'm Will.
And this is our 20th take.
Let's get back to the show.
So one of the things that it was interesting to me, though, was when Barney describes like 2 sort of little wings coming out with red lights on them, almost like fins. And trying to figure out what those were. And when you look at the drawings that they did, you see this flat disc thing with windows. And then on the edges of them are these little wings, which are, in terms of air flight, are pointless. They're like little triangles that stick out and they have red lights on them. And he didn't know what they were. And they saw them unfold, I think, through the binoculars, which is the other thing. And so there's a lot of speculation about what those would have been about. But what's interesting to me, and I thought about this, as a car guy, and also playing into the part of how your own environment or the things that you know seem to influence what you perceive in these situations. The 57 Chevy they were driving had very pronounced fins on the back of it. It's one of the most pronounced. These cars were on the back end of the rocket age cars that were coming out. All the cars, all the influences on them, the Ford Futura and the Galaxy 500 and all of these cars had rocket influences in their elements of design. That was a very prominent thing that was taking place during car design in this period. And the 57 Chevy, which they had, which is a really desirable hot rod even to this day. At one point, I don't know if they're still at the top of the market, but these, restored versions of these things are going for $100,000 these days. Back then, it was an affordable but nice sports car, considered, a very strong sports car. But it does have big fins on the back of it, not as big as the Cadillac Eldorado, which everybody knows those fins. And that was only 1 year that the Cadillac had those. But it's interesting to me that the parallels between what they drew in this drawing, which look like space age, rocket age fins with a 50s design to them, almost coming out of the disc, that matches their own car to a certain extent. This story has been covered by a million paranormal podcasts and lots of people, and I'm sure someone else has made that same observation, but it was something that jumped out to me. So, and again, they don't know what those lights did.
Right. And again, it could be a confluence of something that is familiar and maybe your mind using those to plaster over things that you've never seen that are out of this world.
You don't have the language.
You don't have the mental capacity to picture it in your mind. It would blow your mind because it's something that your mind cannot handle, because it may be something that your brain just can't process. We see with our brains, not with our eyes.
I'm glad you said that, because I am not implying that, they drew a spaceship that looks like a car because it was the 50s. What I am saying is that maybe they were looking at something they couldn't understand. So what terms do you use to describe it? You use terms that make sense to you, just like you do in any situation where it's like you see something you've never seen before. Oh, well, it reminded me of a balloon. It reminded me of this. Or I saw these things that looked like fins. On the other hand, is it also that the owners of these crafts are somehow manipulating your perception and causing your perception to lean into things that are familiar to you, which is why in this case it had an element of a 57 Chevy, and in Woodrow Derenberger's case, in the Mothman prophecies, for people that don't know who he is or are not familiar with that story, he pulled over on the side of the road and conversed with a guy who got out of a spaceship that was hovering above the road that looked like a sideways lantern and, made all those noises Forrest was just talking about. So that would be an older time car for that period. Of course, that was a later time period, though. That was 1967. So it's an interesting idea, but maybe if these things are pulling from your mind and exposing you to images that are popular to you, maybe Woody was into older cars. Yeah. I think that there is a fluidity to reality, to borrow your term that you mentioned in terms of the story and the Rashomon of it all. There's a fluidity to the reality that maybe that affects the perception. The perception is wrapped up in that too. And that's why you probably... I feel like maybe you can't trust anything that people think they saw, but that doesn't mean that something wasn't there.
Well, that's what I'm saying, is that something otherworldly is there. And as we said at the beginning and many times before, it might look different to everyone who sees it, just slightly based on your experience. It may not be an effect that they're trying to create. That's just something that happens. And there's so many things they don't seem to understand about humans, and for an advanced race seem puzzled by them. The simplest things that we think are very simple everyday things, they just don't get because, well, one, who cares? they're here for another bigger picture for DNA or repopulating their dying planet, whatever it is. And how we work is a minimal kind of function to understand, so we're controllable perhaps. But they seem amazed at some of the simplest things that us humans find every day and commonplace. And Mitch, in the same way that we're discovering things about animals that we tend to take care of, and sea creatures that we capture, tag, and try to do things for their best interest in their own health and the perpetuation of their species. Whereas I'm not sure, maybe that's what's going on, maybe not, with their interference with us, with them interrupting our journeys. It seems likely from my interpretation that there are some things going on physically, like we have some physical evidence, there's machinery going on, high technology, but also the workings of the human mind. And now what we're left with is trying to put these pieces together of this puzzle with flawed parts because they come from the human mind. But I also believe the human mind is beyond reproach. It just is what it is, and it's an experience, and we are not meant to really make sense of it. We just have the ability to do so afterwards.
I'm glad you brought up the physical evidence. That's the next thing I wanted to talk about. And again, this is important. This is actual physical evidence that something happened to them. It is not something taken from hypnosis or from a dream. And one of those things was that when Betty was talking to her sister Janet, Janet had a family friend who was an ex-police chief and also knew a physicist who both suggested they should take a compass out to the car and see if anything was going on with it magnetically, and which I love that the physicist suggested this, I guess. So she grabbed a compass and she went outside and she noticed on the trunk of the car, which is where they heard the buzzing sounds focusing when they were driving. They seemed to be on or around or in the trunk somehow. And she could see these small concentric shiny circles in the paint that looked different from the other parts of the paint around the car. And she was like, okay, well, that's strange. And then she put the compass down on top of those points. And when she moved the compass over those points, the compass spun. The needle just would spin and spin and spin and spin. And when she would come away from that, it would find a north. Now, of course, it might be influenced by magnetism in the car, but it wasn't spinning. However, over these circles, which they know weren't there before they left for their trip, and they could identify them, that's where the compass was spinning like crazy. And she eventually was able to show this to their upstairs neighbors, Betty and Barney's upstairs neighbors, who were very good friends of theirs and tenants, I believe, of theirs, because she had gotten through a pretty savvy land deal, which she had done, where she had sold her lot and then got a good deal for her lot and then moved her house to another lot and then took tenants in. She's smart. Yeah. She was a smart person when it came to this kind of stuff. So, and these folks were her friends and they hung out a lot. They were very good friends. And so they came down and they looked at it. Other people witnessed this, including Kathleen Martin. They saw the compass spinning over these spots in the car. I think Kathleen had either younger or older brothers who were trying to rub the paint and like in the spots where they were. And Betty got concerned. She's like, what if it's radioactive? She was like, stop, don't touch it. By the way, Forrest, earlier when you mentioned that their watches had stopped, I don't know what time Barney said, but Betty said 5:16. So that would be 5:16 in the morning, which made me wonder, is that when if they had missing time is that when they were returned to their car and put back on the road somehow in a trance-like state, and they snapped back into reality, but the watch just didn't survive that process.
Right. Or did it happen at the start when they first heard the buzzing and everything became immobilized?
Yeah, but if it did, that's the thing. It was 2 or 3 in the morning when it all started, and the watch said 5:16. So that's why it makes me think it's on the back end of it. But I am speculating because they got home at dawn. So which would have been not too long after that.
And the trip should have only taken about 4 hours.
Yeah, I think it was something like that.
Right.
They thought they were going to get home at 3 and they got home at 5 or 6, I think. So I did want to know a little bit more about this, the magnetism of the car, and I went back to a friend of ours podcast, which is something we mentioned on the show before. It's the Mad Scientist podcast by Dr. Chris Cogswell, also co-hosted by our good friend Marie Mayhew, who has been on our show. Both of them have. Cogs is a longtime original founding member, actually they both are, of the Astonishing Research Corps. And Dr. Cogswell, as we like to call him, Doc Cogs, he has a degree from the University of New Hampshire. This is where this happened, in both chemical engineering and philosophy, which is a great combination. And then he has a PhD in chemical engineering from Northeastern University. And when he covered this case, and he's also, he loves to explore this kind of stuff, but he also approaches it with a skeptical eye. And he's like, well, I don't know about this part or that part, but he loves to look at these kind of cases. This is a quote from his section on this magnetism as it relates to the Betty and Barney Hill case. No one has ever claimed to have seen the circles besides the hills, and they were said to have simply washed away after the next rainfall. Now, I did not read that. I want to ask Kathleen that question, but I'm curious about that. These are interesting, though, because what could have possibly caused these sort of magnetic anomalies in the first place? Magnetism stems from the atomic structure of a material where the quantum spin state of the electrons in the structure become aligned all in one direction, creating a net magnetic field. Basically, you can imagine that each electron in an atom has its own small magnetic field due to it constantly being in motion, particularly due to its spin motion and momentum. When these magnetic fields go against one another, so in other words, have equal magnitude but opposite direction, then you end up with a net zero magnetic field and no magnetism for the bulk material. On the other hand, in some materials, these smaller magnetic fields align naturally, creating a permanent magnet, such as those holding up my drawings currently on our fridge. Again, I'm reading this from, this is from a transcript of Doc Cogs' show. These permanent magnets are known as ferromagnetic materials. Now, in some materials known as paramagnetic materials, you can also induce magnetism, for instance, by applying an electric charge or magnetic field to the material, forcing the electrons to align magnetically for a period of time. You can also create magnetic fields by temperature or pressure changes to induce changes in the crystal structure, or even by heating up or cooling the material to remove defects that would normally stop magnetism. This is, for example, how superconductors work, with cooling of the superconductor removing the electrical resistance or amount of energy lost transferring electricity through the material, resulting in extremely high attainable magnetic fields. In theory, if the Hills are telling the truth about this magnetic shift of their car's hood, and it was the trunk actually, then it would have been an induced magnetic transition. In other words, a change from the trunk, I'm saying trunk instead of hood, being normally non-magnetic to paramagnetic. As far as I can tell, the Hills drove a 57 Chevy Bel Air, beautiful car, which had a steel body. You can induce short-term magnetism on steel by basically applying a magnetic field to it for some time. So potentially, I guess it would be possible for the alien encounter to have applied magnetism to their car, assuming that they used some kind of weird electromagnetic field of some sort to slow the car down or something. Cogs then goes on to speculate, why would they do that? And we'll hear this when we talk more in part 2 about what they were called under hypnosis, but they were stopping because they saw, creatures in front of their car. So why would the aliens need to slow it down this way? But again, he says it would only be induced magnetism since they didn't notice the car's body changing or becoming damaged in any way. Something we would expect if a phase transition from a non-magnetic alloy to a magnetic crystal would occur, for example. And since again, we have no evidence for these circles besides the Hills' claims, it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense given what we currently know about the way magnets work that this would have occurred. As for radiation inducing this sort of magnetic shift, that would only occur due to a change in the crystallinity of the material, which again would likely result in damage to the car's trunk. The magnetic field theory does hold some water, however, because their watches were supposedly damaged after their encounter, something that could be caused by a magnetic field messing with some of the internal components of the watch. and which would not really make a lot of sense otherwise. All in all, then, the physical evidence for this case isn't exactly a slam dunk for Team Aliens, but it's also not great for Team Rational Scientific Explanation. So I love that. And that's what I love about Cog's perspective. He's like, show me the evidence. He's trying to apply the scientific method to it. He wants to believe, but he's also like, I know how science works, and there's things about this that don't make sense. A very, very special thanks to our friend Dr. Chris Cogswell for letting us share that information from that particular episode of the Mad Scientist podcast. You can find that anywhere you get your podcasts. Even though it's out of production, the episodes are still up there. And very entertaining. So he's saying, well, yeah, I can't really explain why this would be this way, but he's also saying, look, this is just the Hill saying this, and I agree with him. This is Betty and Barney saying this, and then they're saying that additionally, their neighbor saw it, that they have multiple witnesses who can corroborate it, and we'll ask Kathleen about it when we have her on next week, and I'll be curious to hear what she says. I believe them, but maybe I want to believe at this point, but I think that this probably really happened. It is curious to say, well, how did it happen? Why did it happen? Why would the spaceship need to control the car? I mean, is this the end result of some kind of tractor beam?
Well, yeah, duh. Of course it is.
I mean,
well, I'm very wary and cautious when it comes to applying fallible human logic to these events.
Yes.
Well, one, you don't know exactly what's going on or what went on. You know what I'm saying? It's like you have... Yeah, these are conscious memories, but they're still a little foggy. And I think in this case, there's the more solid things to go by, but it's all a little dreamy. And so you don't know exactly what's going on. You're left with some evidence that was also dealt with and experienced while still in this state of shock.
That's right.
And so again, not that it wasn't interpreted correctly, but just it's all a little foggy. And I don't doubt that people saw these things as they were happening. The compass spinning wildly, the concentric circles that we're seeing, the tears in the clothing and the scuffing of the shoes. All these things are tangible and real. And yes, these things could have been faked, but it doesn't seem very likely in this scenario that you have faked objects. There were some other objects that could have proven it, but it's like so many of these cases as well, doing callbacks to all of our other shows like Truman Bethurham, where he could have grabbed something. Or as Neil deGrasse Tyson says, like, well, if you want proof, you want me to believe in it, take an ashtray off the ship. Like, grab me something physical that I can see and test and measure. Then come to me with this claim, rather than just something anecdotal. So you have a little bit of that, but it's not outrageously fantastical evidence. But there are small things that were odd to the Hills themselves, like Barney's pants had, what do you call them in the South?
We call them hitchhikers.
You also have a note here, pickers.
Yeah, well, pickers is what they called, what they in Captured, that's what they referred to. So maybe that's a New
I think
England
it's a
term
regional
for it.
thing. I think what we call them was chickweed, where they get in your socks and they're pointed.
We have them at the beach in North Carolina as well, and they get in your poor dog's paws.
Again, it's like, it's so you claim you've got some, you ran through the weeds. Who cares?
Yes.
But to them, that's unusual because they don't remember doing that. Barney's shoes were scuffed on the tops of the toes. Well, what would that suggest? That he was being carried.
Yeah, maybe dragged with his toes dangling.
Betty's dress was torn, again, as we said, near the zipper. How did that happen? The strap to the binoculars were torn. The leather strap was torn. Did they do that? Again, we're not trying to prove anything. We're just saying that that's what they noticed. And it's like, how did this stuff happen? We don't remember any of that happening. So right now at this phase of the story, we're trying to piece together from their point of view of what's going on here. What happened to us?
The day after this happened, they reported it to Pease Air Force Base, and that base is in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. We'll talk a little bit more about it in a minute, but during this report, Barney actually didn't mention that he saw people or beings in the windows because he was worried about being called crazy. When the officer at the Air Force Base was interested, though, in the wings we had just talked about with the little red lights on them. A Major Henderson created this official report on September 21st, 1961, again within 24 hours of the incident. Now, the report is presented pretty much in its entirety in the book, but Kathleen Martin also sent us the original copies of it. So actually, we wanted to share those so you can hear this report that was made to the Air Force within 24 hours of this whole thing happening. This is the Air Intelligence Information Report 100-1-61, made to the 100th Bomb Wing, based at Pease Air Force Base in New Hampshire. to Major Paul W. Henderson. The date of the information is September 20th, and the date of collection is September 21st. Mr. and Mrs. Barney Hill. They have made no previous reports. Subject: unidentified flying object. On the night of 19th through 20th September, between midnight and 1 a.m., the observers were traveling by car in a southerly direction on Route 3 south of Lincoln, New Hampshire, when they noticed a brightly lighted object ahead of their car at an angle of elevation of approximately 45 degrees. It appeared strange to them because of its shape and the intensity of its lights compared to the stars in the sky. Weather and sky were clear. They continued to observe the moving object from their moving car for a few minutes, then stopped. After stopping the car, they used binoculars at times. They report that the object was traveling north very fast. They report it changed directions rather abruptly and then headed south. Shortly thereafter, it stopped and hovered in the air. There was no sound evident up to this time. Both observers used the binoculars at this point. While hovering, objects began to appear from the body of the object, which they described as looking like wings, which made a V shape when extended. The wings, in quotes, had red lights on the tips. At this point, they observed it to appear to swoop down in the general direction of their auto. The object continued to descend until it appeared to be only a matter of hundreds of feet above their car. At this point, they decided to get out of that area, and fast. Mr. Hill was driving, and Mrs. Hill was watching the object by sticking her head out the window. It departed in a generally northwesterly direction, but Mrs. Hill was prevented from observing its full departure by her position in the car. They report that while the object was above them after it had swooped down, they heard a series of short, loud buzzes, which they described as sounding like someone had dropped a tuning fork. They report that they could feel these buzzing sounds in their auto. No further visual observation was made of this object. They continued on their trip, and when they arrived in the vicinity of Ashland, New Hampshire, about 30 miles from Lincoln, they again heard the buzzing sound of the object. However, they did not see it at this time. Now, again, I'm just going to interrupt here. This is where they may have had the missing time. And as they're reporting it here, again, also, Barney did not mention that he saw beings inside windows. All right, coming back to the report. Miss Hill reported the flight pattern of the object to be erratic, changed directions rapidly, and during its flight, it ascended and descended numerous times very rapidly. Its flight was described as jerky and not smooth. Mr. Hill is a civil service employee in the Boston Post Office and doesn't possess any technical or scientific training. Neither does his wife. During a later conversation with Mr. Hill, he volunteered the observation that he did not originally intend to report the incident, but inasmuch as he and his wife did in fact see this occurrence, he decided to report it. He says that on looking back, he feels that the whole thing is incredible and he feels somewhat foolish. He just cannot believe that such a thing could or did happen. He says, on the other hand, that they both saw what they reported, and this fact gives it some degree of reality. Information contained herein was collected by means of telephone conversation between the observers and the preparing individual. The reliability of the observer cannot be judged, and while his apparent honesty and seriousness appear to be valid, it cannot be judged at this time. As an additional item, Major Henderson included the following information on the front page of his intelligence report. During a casual conversation on 22nd September 61 between Major Gardner D. Reynolds of the 100th Bomb Wing and Captain Robert O'Doaday, commander of another unit at the Pease Air Force Base, it was revealed that a strange incident occurred at 2:14 local on 20th September. No importance was attached to the incident at that time. Subsequent interrogation failed to bring out any information in addition to the extract of the daily report of the controller. It is not possible to determine any relationship between these two observations, as the radar observation provides no description. All right, so that is the official Project Blue Book report. Now, a lot of people are going to know what Project Blue Book is. Other people are not. It is widely regarded as kind of a waste of time, even by the Robertson panel member, J. Allen Hynek. I want to read this criticism section from Wikipedia about this. Hynek, who was an associate member of the Robertson panel, which recommended that UFOs needed debunking. A few years later, however, Hynek claimed that the Air Force personnel were indifferent, incompetent, and conducted shoddy research. Hynek notes that during its existence, critics dubbed Blue Book the Society for the Explanation of the Uninvestigated. Yeah. Regarding Ruppelt, who's the first person in charge of it, Hynek wrote, quote, "In my contacts with him, I found him to be honest and seriously puzzled about the whole phenomenon," end quote. And a friend, he wrote, who was another person in charge of it, quote, "Of all the officers I worked with in Blue Book, Colonel Friend earned my respect and conducted himself with dignity and a total lack of the bombast that characterized several of the other Blue Book heads," end quote. Hynek claimed that Quintanilla, quote, disregarded any evidence that was counter to his hypothesis, end quote. Hynek also reported bitter exchanges with Moody, describing Moody as the master of the possible balloon, possible aircraft, possible birds, which then became, by his own hand, and I argued with him violently at times, the probable. Author and columnist Robert Schaefer has written that Project Blue Book amassed 12,618 reports. None of them amounted to anything significant or added to our knowledge of any subject, even after more than 50 years of investigation. So Project Blue Book is a very controversial and not widely regarded as successful program to research UFOs, or maybe it was based on disinformation or covering things up, and they're just trying to keep track of possible experimental aircraft that didn't belong to the U.S., and that was a way to do that. But a lot of the things that go into that report, it's a little bit dismissive, and one of the things that there is the conclusion at the end of the report is that they might have seen advertising spotlights.
Well, of course.
Yeah, at 11 a.m. in Franconia Notch, in the middle of where hardly anyone lives, which they looked at through binoculars, by the way, up close. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know who's seen spotlights. I've seen them a million times. It's, you know what they look like. I mean, I guess some rube might mistake them for a UFO, but it's pretty obvious.
Yeah, my point
are.
being is if you're going to believe them about seeing anything at all, then
yeah,
you're going to stop there and not believe them about all the other evidence and the other physical effects and emotional effects that they had later. Why buy any of it? Why buy any of it? You could just discount them saying that they saw anything at all that night, and then maybe speculating about why they might have covered being late for about 2 to 3 hours late. But if you don't believe in any of this at all, then it's an insignificant story anyway, just by people who were just mistaken and saw a searchlight or an aircraft warning light on top of the hill there, which disappeared as they drove along, and it kind of matches up. But like, why the rest of it then?
No, I agree. And here's something else interesting. There was a ground radar sighting that night at 5:22 p.m. This was several hours before what happened to the hills. This was in North Concord, Vermont, 17 miles west of Betty's first sighting from the car. And the comment on that report to Blue Book said, quote, low speed and high altitude with erratic course, end quote, and then probably balloon. So here we're back to the probably balloon, which of course that makes sense. But here's the thing. This thing was traveling against the jet stream. As for the altitude that it was at, it should have gone from west to east, but it was going from east to west. And it looked like a, quote, large aircraft as well, end quote.
Yeah.
And that's the same night, just about like 5 or 6 hours earlier.
To clarify my point earlier, somebody who's in the region, and that does carry a lot of weight for me and a lot of other people. It's like, oh, somebody from the area or from that region knows exactly where they were on the road. Well, one of those folks was Jim McDonald, and he took the journey that the hills took exactly as they described. And he thought, as I was saying, they mistook that light for an aircraft warning beacon on Cannon Mountain. And as he said, well, when you drive the twists and turns at the same time that the hills did, you will see that light kind of disappearing and coming back into view just as they did. So that accounts for the disappearance and the flashing, or what they thought was flashing. And the rest of it, though, was just sleep deprivation. They were tired after a long trip. These memories were just false memories, and the rest of it was recovered under hypnotic regression, which can't be counted anyway. And so basically they were just tired, mistook the light, end of story. And I might agree to that if there weren't all this other stuff that goes along with the story. You know what I'm saying? If that's all they said, like, well, we saw this light, it seemed to be moving erratically, it zipped back and forth. Maybe we pulled over and took a nap and we don't remember. That's a fraction of everything that happened to the hills.
What's interesting about that particular piece of information of the local identifying it as this light on, or the beacon or whatever, that came off the Wikipedia page on the case, right?
It is part of the section that is rebutting the hills. Yeah. So if you find that with some other observations as well. But Jim McDonald, that is not the same guy, or is it, that is actually a friend of the hills, or was a friend of the hills?
I don't know. See, here's what's weird to me. When you follow that link, and you find this a lot with Wikipedia sources, it's a little bit questionable. So it's essentially a blog entry that somebody wrote where they're being analytical about it. And not to say that you shouldn't necessarily believe them, but you can't figure out who that person is. And they did have involvement with a James McDonald, who we're going to talk about here in a minute.
Right.
Who was a friend of theirs, an ex-CIA officer and a retired intelligence officer from Pease Air Force Base at the time. somebody that they hung out with fairly frequently. So it makes me wonder if that particular blogger has taken that name as a kind of mask, or if that's their real name, and maybe that's just a strange coincidence as they're debunking the lights that they saw in the sky. But that's part of the problem sometimes with the quality of sources that Wikipedia provides. The people that put the pages together just grab them from anywhere, and it's like, well, you drill down 1 or 2 levels and you find out it sort of leads to a black hole of definitive.
Well, it's enough. Whatever they did is enough. So
we looked at that entry that he made, and it appears very well researched, but you can't determine who he is or anything about him. And also he has a name that is a dead match for a name of somebody that was very wrapped up in the case. So that's interesting, to say the least, I guess. It's just the quality of information. There's a few holes in that there. But again, it's like, don't tell me what I saw. You know, these are intelligent adults, active members of the community. It's hard for me to imagine that they thought that they were seeing something in the sky that looked like a disc with wings that came out and red lights and people on board. And they looked at it through binoculars while they were stopped. And it was moving towards them, as opposed to just some light that was flickering on a hill as they drove around down the highway through Franconia Notch.
It goes a little further for me than just a sleep deprivation hallucination, which
right.
like you have to be really sleep deprived to be hallucinating that much, or you're just making it up. And then again, that's another story.
Hi, I'm Strike, and when my friend and I aren't staying up until 1 a.m. listening to Astonishing Legends, we're still listening to Astonishing Legends. Let's get back to the show.
Well, all of this stuff, everything that we've relayed so far is chronological order, and that's the order in which things happened. About 10 days after the actual event, Betty starts to have nightmares, and she usually is having them right before waking up in the morning. And she's confused by them because in some cases, they are events that she knows actually happened, the things that they remember from their waking conscious moments. But in other cases, there's new information in them, and she's not sure what to make of it. And they're also happening out of order. It's not chronological, non-sequential. So she starts taking notes on them and trying to put together a timeline of events. And we'll talk a little bit more about what was actually in those nightmares in part 2. But the point is that it's becoming a real problem for her in a post-anxiety phase. So now they start getting into the investigations. And there are scientists who are interested in what happened to them and exploring it further. One of them is Major Donald Kehoe, and he tells them that he wants them to talk to Walter Webb, who is an advisor to NICAP. NICAP is the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena. And we've mentioned that before many times. We've actually mentioned Kehoe before because he was involved in the investigation with what happened to Frederick Valentich. We also mentioned him during the Truman Bethune story when we had Rob Christopherson on, and Rob invoked Donald Kehoe. So a little bit of quick background on him. Donald Edward Kehoe, born in June of 1897, passed away in November of 1988. He was an American Marine Corps naval aviator, writer of aviation articles and stories in a variety of publications, and a tour manager of aviation pioneer Charles Lindbergh. In the 1950s, Kehoe became a UFO researcher and writer, arguing that the U.S. government should conduct research into UFO matters and should publicly release all of its UFO files. Carl Jung argued that Kehoe's first 2 books were, quote, based on official material and studiously avoid the wild speculations, naivete, or prejudice of other UFO publications, end quote. So that's a pretty high praise there coming from Carl there.
Yeah.
And so it was Kehoe who was sending Walter Webb to talk to the Hills. Walter Webb, a little bit of an excerpt on his background. He was a lecturer at the Charles Hayden Planetarium, headed the Massachusetts NICAP Unit No. 1 subcommittee at Cambridge. He's a former member of the Smithsonian Institute Satellite Tracking Program. He's born in 1934, graduated in biology from Mount Union College in Ohio in 1954. Started a career in astronomy under the teachings of Dr. J. Allen Hynek at the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory Optical Satellite Tracking Program from 1957 to 1958, and now retired from Charles Hayden Planetarium, Boston, where he spent 32 years as senior lecturer, assistant director, and operations manager. He was the astronomy consultant of 4 UFO investigations associations, a member of MUFON and CUFOS, and a UFO witness himself in 1951. The first investigator of the Betty and Barney Hill sighting, among others, he found out that among the noise of UFO sighting reports caused by commonplace phenomena, there exists a core of manifestation that are totally unique, and that very strong circumstantial evidence points at extraterrestrial visits as their cause. The Hayden Planetarium, for folks that don't know, that's connected to the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. Neil deGrasse Tyson is currently a staff scientist there.
That's right.
That gives you a little bit on this background. So it's in the Webb report that we find out for the first time that Barney, he goes ahead and he says, look, I saw a row of windows on this craft, and I saw beings in those windows when I looked through my binoculars. Now, Barney, being in denial about UFOs, still thought early on when he was first seeing it, it's just a helicopter. So he couldn't wrap his head around it. What is this thing? It's some military craft that he didn't understand. And that's in Walter Webb's report as well. He also told Webb that he could see these beings were wearing black uniforms with black caps or black peaks or bills on them.
One observation, which is also very movie-like, and you can make the connection that this is all spurred from 50s sci-fi that was readily available at the time. And one episode in particular of The Outer Limits fueled their vivid imaginations. But in this case, what Barney saw through his binoculars into this row of windows, to me, it looked like windows into a hallway. I kind of describe it. You ever seen those? You'll see modern buildings now, like a Walgreens, and they have, well, there's a window, like at a corner of the building or one side of it, and there's like a fake room with a wall on either side. And in the window will be like a lighted W or a Walgreens sign. Or it reminds me of that. Like it's not a real room. I love fake rooms like that, like little fake stuff you see at
like
the things we see at Disneyland, like little fake rooms you can look into.
Hall of Presidents, the Hall of Aliens.
The rest of the building. But what he sees is this row of men or beings in these little caps that seemed kind of like uniforms, military, starcraft or aircraft-like uniforms. And they all turn at one point except for one. And he keeps staring at Barney. And it's that moment, again, very cinematic, where you're staring at somebody through binoculars a distance away and you don't think that you're being observed. And then you realize, oh, they can see you. And that one guy can see you. And he's not turning away. He's staring right at you.
Yeah, and he's looking right at you. And well, so going on in the Webb report, Barney, to that end, said he felt like he was going to be captured, quote, like a bug in a net, end quote. And he could feel that they were not human and that they seemed like superior beings, even though he didn't believe in such things. And so imagine that too. Imagine that's beyond fight or flight. It's like at that point, it's like that thing is more than I am, and it understands how to get me better than I understand how to get away from it.
If you were being chased by some authority, crooks, bad guys, the police, military people, you're James Bond, you're trying to get away, you may not have the technology they do as far as weapons, means to capture you, to subdue you, and incapacitate you or track you. But you're still starting off as human. Like you have a pretty good fighting chance. If you can outsmart them, you can outrun them, you can be more clever than they are, you stand a good fighting chance of getting away or prevailing. Here, there's something weird about this as well. Like I said, there is a psychic sense that both Barney and Betty felt that was beyond just seeing with your own senses or hearing what they're talking about. It's feeling that you're being watched while you're still at home and this event is long over. It's that feeling that they know something about you that you can't get on them. You know what I'm saying? Like that's the superiority, that their brains are working faster, better at a much higher level than we are. And there's nothing you can do about it. And so if they're going to have their way with you, it's just going to happen. So you just better hope they're gentle.
But I have met people that I realized were so much smarter than I was.
That happens all the time with us. Yeah.
Yeah. And I was like, wow. And it was people that, I mean, I'll just say it's people that my wife worked with. And I remember when I met them thinking, boy, I sure am glad that I don't work with this person, because I can't get a read. This person is 5 steps ahead of everybody else. So,
well, this is something different, right? Like I said, somebody could have better schooling, be more witty, more clever than you are, better educated. But this is evolutionary in that you feel it much like, I don't know if other animals do, because look,
no, what you're saying is different. I am telling you that I am equating that exact feeling you just mentioned to actual people, though. I'm saying that they feel evolutionary.
Well, they feel
like
it.
they're playing like they feel like they're playing 3D chess.
No, and they know it. They know what they're doing much of the time. But I would also say this is something beyond this, and this is the ineffable, I guess, aspect of this, where you cannot know this or know what it feels like until it happens to you, and that is that feeling that somebody turns to you, they stare into your eyes, and suddenly they know every moment of your childhood, all of your dark secrets. There's nothing in your brain that they have not just sucked out of your head. And you just know it. And that no other human can do that, but you know that this happened with a superior being. That's what I'm saying. Like, that's the feeling of like, it just must be the most humbling and scary thing ever, but also fascinating, because again, that never happens with another human being. Surely you've met pompous people and much smarter people and you're intimidated by them at cocktail parties, but they don't give you that feeling. That's out of this world. That's the unknowable until it's become known. And so that's what Barney is experiencing here, which adds to his fear and also a sense of submission. Not that he didn't try to get away. The other thing that was mentioned, that they felt these, although they were diminutive beings, they were very strong. There were physical aspects that were described.
Again, those are hypnosis details, right?
These are hypnosis details, but what I'm saying is that you have some observational details through the binoculars while they are conscious and awake, and then you add to that the close-up aspects of it, and it seems to make sense when you piece the whole experience together.
Yes.
So either your brain is filling that in just to make sense of this, but what they can see is a starting point, a jumping off then for your imagination, if the rest of it is just filled in by your brain to make up for gaps in an extraordinary experience.
Here's the other thing to think about this. Whenever, and this is something that occurred to me when we were looking at this case, and whenever you went to catch something, even as a kid, to play with it, an ant, a bug, a lizard, whatever, get a fish out of an aquarium at the store to take home to your aquarium, or conduct a study on something, what do? You try to catch the one off by itself. After all, you only need one, right? And it's easier to catch one than it is to catch a bunch, or maybe, I don't know. It just seems like that's what always happens with these stories. But if you believe any of this at all, but here's my question. Why don't aliens just drop down into Times Square, scoop up 50 people so they can get one to experiment on and discard the other 49? Just throw them out from the 10th floor of their altitude of 1,000 feet up, and the other 49 bite the dust, and they go off with the one, do the experiments, and then throw it out. Why doesn't it go down that way, you think?
There was an alien abduction, or several of them, in New York City during one of the MUFON conventions, I believe. I'm sorry, I don't know the details. I can't remember off the top of my head here, but there was something in New York City. It's as a point to counteract, well, why does this always happen to farmers out in the middle of nowhere?
No, I know I know UFOs have been seen outside of high-rises in New York, for sure. But I'm talking about like the remote abduction thing. Why is that happening?
Because one of the things we can glean, if this is all true, any of it's true, is that there is an element that they don't want to be widely known, right? That's the whole landing on the White House lawn aspect of this. They still are trying to maintain a bit of secrecy. You can connect the Men in Black saying, like, don't talk about this. They show up at your door. Well, who cares? No one's going to believe you, right? But why do Men in Black show up and say, don't talk about this? Why is our own government squashing this and they don't want their own personnel to talk about this? Why do you have Project Blue Book to kind of debunk all this stuff?
That's what I'm saying. It points to a cover-up. And I'm not into those kind of conspiracies. Not something we talk about a lot on Astonishing Legends, but it is a little strange that there's a cover-up coming from both sides of the equation.
Well, yeah, they each have their own agenda, but look at the phenomenon
from us
itself.
and them.
But take a look at, if you want to connect the phenomenon to this as being a separate thing, UFOs, and then whatever the heck is going on at Skinwalker Ranch, it's part of that trickster element of staying one step ahead. Is like, you're not going to get a handle on this. We won't let you, but we'll give you a taste just to confound you. And with this case here with Barney and Betty Hill, there was an objective, there was an agenda by these beings to do their experiments or whatever they're going to do. But also not just, like I said, they just didn't pull up in the middle of the intersection in New Hampshire somewhere to scoop up a bunch of people or to make their presence well known. These things by them are still kind of done on the sly, and there's some subterfuge and a bit of covering their tracks. Yeah. Again, with the screen memories, like why do that at all? Why not just do your operations on people and then they remember everything and then they seem like raving lunatics? With this case, with Barney and Betty, and they both, I believe, said this, there was an effort on the part of these natural visitors to return their lives back to as normal as they could have been. Put them back on the road, back on the path, get back to your daily life. Here's your dress, but it's a little messed up.
Yeah.
Sorry we didn't fix your watches while we're at it. It's just like, here's a bunch of stuff, get out of here. Same thing again, back with Terry Lovelace. His sock is on sideways. His boots are not really well tied. They're just kind of shoved on. It's like, it's good enough. We're out of here. Smell you later. So
smell you later.
But they don't totally just announce themselves either. Like there's some kind of there's a calculus there of being kind of hidden, but also being kind of seen, because you can't be totally hidden. You got to do your things. And so some people are going to see them. Why didn't they go around zapping the memories of all the other people that saw the same craft that Barney and Betty Hill did that night?
Yeah, and by the way, I don't know if we've mentioned that yet, and I think Kathleen Martin's going to talk about it, but there are 14 or 15 witnesses
that saw the same light phenomenon in the sky.
That saw something in the area that Betty and Barney had their experience at. Well, some other things that Barney added in the web report was that, as we said, it was dead silent and then no light from it reached the ground. And by the way, we did find the web report. We have the full thing. It's 61 pages. We'll make it available to anyone that wants to read it themselves. But another thing to point out is that Captured, the book that we've been referencing here, has recounted that the information that Barney relayed here was all before he started hearing about Betty's dreams. Now, there's been a lot of speculation and implication from skeptics that Barney took memories of his experience from hearing about Betty's dreams. And some of this comes from Dr. Benjamin Simon's hypnosis sessions and how people have interpreted them. And we'll talk more about that in part 2 with Betty's niece and the co-author of the book where we're referencing the most. But that's why we're pointing out that he recalled this information independently of Betty's dreams. And again, that these are conscious memories, not information obtained under hypnosis. Now, I did want to mention poor Delcy the dog. I know we mentioned that Delcy got put in the car. The dachshund, who, as far as the Hills knew, had been in the backseat of the car the whole time. Delcy became sick after their encounter. They'd gotten her only a month and a half before, but she'd been completely healthy prior to this night. But after this night, she had consistent respiratory problems and skin infections. At which point, Betty actually remembered that they never washed her or gave her a bath after whatever happened that evening. She also seemed to start having lots of nightmares of her own. Of course, all dogs do this. My dogs included. The howling in the sleep and the eyes twitching and the growling and whatever
I like
else.
the running, the paws moving.
Yeah, the running, exactly. And so we're acknowledging this is anecdotal evidence, and so did Betty. But to Betty and Barney, it seemed like it was happening a lot more after the incident. This brings us to the keys, one of my favorite details of this story, and it's a very small thing, but it's a big thing too. In Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where the Hills lived, it was the home, as we said at the time, to the Pease Air Force Base, now an Air National Guard base. Now, as a result, the Hills both had lots of friends who worked on the base, including a close friend, ex-CIA officer and retired Air Force intelligence officer, Jim McDonald, coincidentally named... the same as the guy who says they saw a light on the mountains on a blog somewhere. So anyway, Jim McDonald, he was one of the first ones that told them they might want to consider hypnosis to recover things they couldn't remember. Boy, aren't I going to feel foolish if this Jim McDonald changed his mind and is the one who wrote the thing saying it was
Well,
light
he
on the
was
mountain.
from the area, it says.
Well, there you go. So we'll see. Anyway. During the time that all this was going on, they were returning to the White Mountains where where the area where it happened to try and find the exact location of the incident. They had memories of a steel trestle like railroad bridge, with the steel cage around it. And they also both had vague memories of some kind of roadblock, as we mentioned, and an orange fiery sphere or something that prevented them from passing. This is when something happened that adds another dimension to this case. Again, a clear conscious memory, not a nightmare, not hypnosis recovered memory. They had gone to the White Mountains for an entire day, scouring the back roads, looking for where they had been. And when they came back home to Portsmouth, they entered their home, which was locked up. And in their kitchen on the table, there was a pile of dried brown leaves just sitting there. When they spread the leaves apart, a pair of Betty's earrings were there. It was ones that she had worn the night they had the encounter and that had gone missing. They were there on the table with some leaves. There was no sign of breaking and entering and no way for them to figure out how whomever returned them had got them there. Betty got very upset. She started crying. She didn't want Barney to see how upset she was, so she picked them up and put them away and never wore them again. And Kathleen Martin still has that pair of earrings. Or she has a photo of them. I don't know. There's a part of a collection that she gave to a museum in New Hampshire. So they're either at the museum or in her possession.
At the university, perhaps.
Yeah, at the university, excuse me, along with the watch. But yeah, so those earrings, let's talk about that a little bit. They mysteriously appeared in their house. By the way, they lived alone. No one had a key to their home.
Right.
So this begs all kinds of questions. Who would have brought the earrings back? If you believe any of this at all, if they did get abducted, did the aliens feel bad they brought them back? Why did they come in a pile of leaves and put them on the table?
That's the bigger
question.
question.
Who would think if it's a human, why would you bring the leaves and put them there? Are you messing with people? Is it a psyop? Is it the CIA? Is it disinformation? Somebody's breaking in and trying to gaslight them? What is going on with her earrings being returned from the middle of nowhere to their kitchen table in a pile of leaves?
Let's say it's a psyop that they're trying to gaslight these people. It would be, to my logic, because they had seen something that needs to be covered up or be made fun of or make the Hills think they're going crazy in order to cover something up that they weren't supposed to see. But I don't think that happened because on the more rational, mundane side, they saw nothing at all except some aircraft warning lights.
Right.
So if it's an apportation and apporting of the earrings, now this is getting back to the metaphysical, spiritual ghost side of this. Like the ghosts, another phenomenon happening. That something is coming through from a portal, like that leaf just got scooped up in them. Or it could be one case that I'm reminded of is Otis, who last name was trying to develop a anti-gravitational craft, and there was missing time and twigs and berries and debris on the guys that were trying to fly this thing. They had no idea how it happened. So I'm saying
you should say twigs and berries.
Twigs and berries, sir. The idea, though, is that there was dried brush and snap twigs and leaves on their clothes. It's like, well, how did that happen? And why is there missing time? So maybe something within the anti-gravitational aspect of this kind of travel, you get dragged through stuff that you didn't expect. Or it's a product that comes through from the other side of the phenomenon, like a portal, you could say.
Yeah, right. Okay, so that's a really good suggestion. I hadn't thought about that. So like you're saying it's apportation, the aliens or something, or it's a paranormal event, whatever. The earrings were apported from the ground in the woods back to their table as a courtesy.
I didn't think of that. It's that it was maybe lost in the woods, and they just scooped it up. And here you go. We're going to shoot this back onto your kitchen table. Isn't that nice of us? Oh, by the way, what about the mess? Sorry. And you have some leaves that came with it, or because again, well, why did it need to be hidden or covered by leaves on the kitchen table?
No, why would you need to do that?
Yeah.
It does. It seems like maybe it's kind of like when the Terminator came through and there's a big sphere of space that just ate everything he was near.
You got a bunch of trash and papers whirling around that were put there by the scenic crew for the movie. Yeah,
it's beamed up in a spherical shape or off the floor of the wherever they fell off so maybe the earrings got returned along with some of the detritus that was surrounding them wherever they were.
That sounds like more part of a ghost story than a UFO story.
Yeah, and that's what we're going to get to here in a second. But nevertheless, after that, they weren't necessarily going for those far-flung reasoning that we just went through. But they were thinking someone's coming and going from their house, so they were getting concerned about their personal security, and so were their relatives. There was another time when Betty went to pick up the phone. It's not clear whether she's making a call or answering a call, and as soon as she picked it up, she heard someone on the other end say, "Base intelligence." So she was convinced that their phone was tapped. So tonight, with the exception of the opening quote, where Betty mentions that they look grotesque and are not human, at the top of the show. All of the information in part one of this series, aside from a few small anecdotes about hypnosis details on Betty and Barney, is taken from their conscious waking memories of that night. The quote at the top of the show came from a note that Betty sent to Dr. Benjamin Simon about one of her nightmares. Later, he would be the one to conduct hypnosis sessions on both of them, and we'll talk about that in part two. But for now, listener, when you think back on what you've learned about Betty and Barney Hill's experience, we ask you to remember that all of the information here so far was pre-hypnosis and does not refer to anything recalled during hypnosis. The case thus far is presented based on their conscious memories as eyewitnesses to these events. But we'd like to remind people of some details for folks who think they may have dreamt it all up. Again, the tops of Barney's shoes were scuffed and damaged somehow. The zipper on Betty's dress was torn. There was a pink powder on her dress. Both of their watches stopped and could not be restarted. And even though this is anecdotal, the compass, when it spun wildly, when they conducted an experiment holding it over shiny concentric circles on the trunk of their car, and multiple people witnessed that, including next week's guest. 4 months after the event, Barney also found that he had physical symptoms in his groin area that would coincide with something that he would recall under hypnosis. So that would seem to corroborate some of the details that came from hypnosis, if you make a connection between those two things. And again, we'll talk about that next week. Setting aside things that may have been imagined and can't be proven beyond eyewitness testimony, Barney's shoes, Betty's dress, and the broken watches are all things that can still be seen today. The compass experiment was conducted in front of numerous eyewitnesses who all corroborated that they saw it spinning at those spots on the car, including Betty's niece, again, who will be with us next week. But aside from the physical effects Barney would be dealing with in a few months, there is more evidence that has been studied and revealed to have stood up to scientific scrutiny, in spite of the information having been obtained under hypnosis, including a star map that Betty recalled being showed during their abduction that has been thoroughly researched and found to have an 86% match to a specific part of the sky from a specific perspective. There is so much more to this story, including that when scientists encouraged Betty to conduct psychophysics experiments by trying to psychically communicate with what they believed to be their captors, multiple members of her family began to experience what can only be described as paranormal events. We'll be back in part 2 next week to talk about all of this, and more extensively with our very special guest, Betty Hill's niece, author, and eyewitness to many of these events herself, Kathleen Marden. For tonight, we'll leave you with the following excerpt from the book that Marden co-authored with Stanton Friedman. This is from page 206 of Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience, 60th Anniversary Edition.
In a letter dated January 14, 1966, Betty described her family as hard-headed practical realists who were beginning to feel on edge over the intrusion of paranormal activities into their homes. She wrote, "These things are happening to Barney and me as well as to most of my relatives, but they have been witnessed by other people who are present. We do not believe in ghosts, but we do believe in space travel and life on other planets. So we wonder if these space travelers might have the ability to be unseen to us." Next, Betty described numerous puzzling, intrusive events, including the December 10, 1965 appearance of a chunk of ice on her kitchen table. She wrote, "Barney and I returned home from work and found a chunk of ice on the kitchen table, under a newspaper. The newspaper was in the same spot I had left it in that morning. At the time, there was no ice outdoors, only ice cubes in the refrigerator. It was oval-shaped and had some kind of imprint on it. We were so shocked about this that we hurriedly put it in the sink to melt so we could forget about it."
That's going to wrap up episode 287 of Astonishing Legends, part 1 of our 2-part series on the abduction of Betty and Barney Hill. A very special thanks to Kathleen Marden for sharing her research and files on the case. We'll be hearing from her directly in part 2 next week. Thanks to Jim Harold for getting us connected with her, and thanks to Dr. Chris Cogswell. Well, we're still on our summer schedule, so that means our next new show is next week. After that, we'll have a 3-week break. Meanwhile, find and subscribe to the other shows from the Astonishing Legends Network, The Midnight Library, Scared All the Time, and Richard Haddam's Paranormal Bookshelf. We have links to all of them in our show notes. You can also find us at patreon.com/astonishinglegends.
Astonishing Legends is edited by Sarah Voorhees-Wendell at VW Sound and co-produced by Tess Feifel, who is also head of research and the social media manager. Our technical producer is Ed Vicola, or as we call him, the Mechanic. Special thanks to our announcer, John Boland.
Hi, I'm Melissa Richmond, and I give permission to Astonishing Legends to use my voice however they see fit.
WILLMOSE.
Our theme, which is available as a ringtone, was composed by Judson Crane at foundermusic.com. All other music and sound design for the show is composed and created by Alan Carestia.
Our logo was created by Tommy Beaver Design, and our animated graphics for social media and YouTube are done by Joshua Sloan at deadstreetproductions.com.
Every episode going back to September of 2020 has a transcription available on its corresponding webpage at our website. Earlier transcriptions can be made available upon request to astonishingcontact@gmail.com.
Astonishing Legends would not be possible without you, our listeners. Visit our store at astonishinglegends.com or interact with us and other listeners on Instagram, Twitter, Discord, Facebook, and YouTube.
You can also visit us at patreon.com/astonishinglegends, where patrons have access to additional bonus content, including the Patreon exclusive show Astonishing Junk Drawer, which is available every week. The main show is not. No part of this show may be reproduced anywhere without permission. Copyright Astonishing Legends Productions.
Good night.